A joke cost him his skin, literally. Welcome to Buried Edge. I'm your host. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. Your thoughts breathe life into these dark histories. Let's get started. The first strip of flesh was taken from the cheek, just below the eye, where laughter had once lived. They did not begin with the hands or the chest or the thighs. No, they started with the mouth, with the muscle that had dared to curl in jest, to twitch at royal absurdity. A blade, thin as a whisper and curved like a crescent moon, was drawn across the skin until the blood welled as though memory itself was bleeding. His screams, they say, were not of pain, but of recognition, that in mocking a voice, he had summoned the silence of death. His body was tethered upright against a lattice of oiled pine, arms spread like a crucifix, legs lashed at the ankles with raw sinew taken from others before him. Around him, nobles gathered in perfumed horror, their gloved hands fluttering like anxious birds, pretending their eyes did not burn at the spectacle they had funded with silence. He was stripped, not just of skin, but of status, of humanity, of meaning, in deliberate, poetic slowness. This was not an execution. This was a theater. And the stage was flesh. He was not born to be a martyr, nor sculpted for tragedy. His origins were meager, but not ignoble. The son of a parchment merchant and a mother whose voice once earned coins in taverns for songs that made grown men blink back tears. In a quarter of the city where soot braided itself into the lace of every window pane and dogs ran with ribs showing, he learned to speak with rhythm, to mimic the cadence of priests, barons, and butchers alike. They called it gift at first, his ability to catch a man's tone and toss it back like a mirror dipped in wine. But gifts, in kingdoms ruled by brittle egos and velveted rage, rot into curses when they reach the wrong ears. The court was a thing of tremulous balance, silks covering daggers, laughter masking dread. The king, whose voice was known to rise with a whistle when displeased and crack like pottery when enraged, tolerated no echo of his own flaws. He walked as if the throne extended under each footstep, and he spoke as if his words had been chiseled on tablets in flame. Those who failed to laugh when he jested were marked. Those who laughed too heartily were buried under frost. In this fragile theater of obedience, the wrong note sung by the wrong mouth could dissolve the illusion, and illusions, once ruptured, must be punished more severely than crimes. The man who would be flayed for a laugh was known first as Etienne of the threaded tongue, a jester not by appointment, but by rebellion, a mimic who carved royalty with satire so finely drawn it was mistaken for admiration. In wine-stained halls or behind market stalls, his imitations could coax gasps and coin. He could make a bishop weep with laughter or a guard clutch his sides with shame. But what began as defiance in back alleys and midnight dens began to spill into places where ears were paid to report, not enjoy. One day, in a gathering of minor nobles celebrating a royal anniversary with overripe meats and lukewarm affection, Etienne let loose a performance so precise, so venomously sweet, that a hush fell over the room like sudden snowfall. His voice cracked just so, stammered just so, mimicking the king's strange lisp with surgical cruelty. One woman covered her mouth. One man laughed, then stopped. One servant left the room. Within 2 days, Etienne was gone. No trial, no formal edict, only silence where there had been mirth. What came next was not ordered by scroll or seal. It came whispered. Not death, but demonstration, a lesson etched in blood for those who thought ridicule was a harmless act. They did not come at night. They came at dawn, when the streets were still half asleep, and the market carts had not yet begun their creaking hymns. Etienne was taken from the rented room above a shuttered apothecary, where dust clung to the curtains like old regrets, and the floorboards remembered too many footsteps. He was bound in silence, gagged not to stifle resistance, but to deny him the one weapon he had ever wielded: his voice. They covered his head, but not to hide his shame. It was the crowd they did not want him to see yet, the stage that had been prepared with such grotesque diligence. For this was to be no mere execution. It was a ritual, a slow unmaking. The scaffold had been replaced with a wide circular platform, lined with straw soaked in salt water and old blood, ringed with pikes bearing relics of earlier mockers. Tongues, withered and blackened, nailed like badges. On this stage, Etienne was mounted like a beast, upright, exposed, arms above his head as if in surrender to some mute god. His tunic was removed, but not torn. It was carefully unstitched down the back, folded, and placed beside the platform, a sign of deliberation. This was not rage. This was justice, as the crown defined it. Ornate, performative, unrelenting. The king did not attend. He had no need. His absence was more suffocating than his presence. But others came. Robed counselors who had once smirked behind fingers at Etienne's mimicry, generals whose loyalties flickered with wind, and courtiers who had traded laughter for safety. The crowd was thick with silence and the shifting weight of anticipation. There were children on shoulders, merchants with still bloody hands, even a priest who muttered prayers no one listened to. The executioner wore no hood. His face was pale, with eyes that did not blink and hands that moved like calligraphy. They began at the mouth. The cheeks first, flayed downward in twin ribbons, revealing the raw pulsing of exposed tissue. It was not swift. The blade traced his skin with priest-like reverence, as though each cut were a sacrament. Etienne's scream, when it came, was muffled, not by cloth, but by disbelief. The pain was not just physical. It was the shattering of self. His tongue, once sharp as polished steel, was left untouched. That would come later. Now they wanted him to speak if he could, to let his voice stumble into ruin, to let the people hear how mockery turned to whimper. The chest came next, long strokes down the sternum, pulling flesh away in sheets. The skin curled at the edges like parchment too close to fire. Blood, warm and bitter with fear, soaked the salt-strewn straw. Flies came, summoned as if by sacred rite. Etienne's body trembled, not in resistance, but in the convulsions of a man whose nerves were no longer sure where they belonged. His breathing, erratic, hissed through broken teeth. Each gasp was a confession, each sob an absolution of laughter past. When they reached his thighs, the crowd had already begun to turn away, not out of pity, but out of exhaustion. The spectacle was too much. And yet, none left. Not truly. They lingered. They watched through the corners of their eyes, pretending not to. This too was part of the punishment. To see and to remember, and to pretend later they had not. As the skin of his back was removed in long, fluttering strips, someone in the crowd vomited. A child cried out and was hushed. Somewhere, far above the square, bells tolled for noon, though time had ceased to matter on that platform. Etienne was no longer a man. He was a canvas of warning, a ritual of retribution, a breathing monument to the price of derision. They spared his face, not from mercy, but from strategy. To preserve the resemblance, to let those who had laughed before now see what remained. His eyes, wide and glassy, fixed on no one and nothing, had lost their luster. The mimic was gone. What remained was pulp and memory. Still he lived. For hours. The flaying was slow, calculated. Pauses were taken not for rest, but for breathless observation. Courtiers whispered of the blade's sharpness, the executioner's artistry, the king's silent cruelty. Etienne's body sagged but did not fall. The ropes were pulled tighter. The spectacle was not over. This was not justice. This was a lesson etched into sinew and silence. They kept him alive beyond what the body should have permitted, suspending him not only from the scaffold's iron braces, but from the edge of death itself. What followed the agony was not silence, but something colder, the arrival of madness, quiet as frost upon a mirror. In the hours after the major flaying had ceased, when only scraps of skin clung to his lower limbs and one eye had begun to glaze, Etienne did not speak. But he began to move his mouth in the shape of words no one could hear. His tongue, swollen and red as a dying ember, formed syllables only he could understand. Some said he was mocking still, that in his delirium he repeated the king's lisped decrees like a cursed lullaby. Others claimed he prayed to a god who had already turned his face away. Whatever the truth, there was movement beneath the ruin. And in that movement something shifted in the onlookers, a tremor not of pity, but of collective unease. The body becomes unholy when it forgets to die, and Etienne forgot. For a full day and part of a second night, he remained lashed to that wheel of pain, his breath like the dragging of wet leaves, his gaze no longer human. They brought him water twice, not in mercy, but to prolong the torment. Both times he refused. His mouth opened, and blood poured instead. The executioner, no longer needed, withdrew. His work had become something else now, something spiritual. The performance had entered its final act, and it required no blade. Only time. Only suffering. In the darkness before the second dawn, it is said Etienne began to sing. Not loud, not whole, not melodic, but rhythmic, broken phrases from childhood songs, fragments of chants, nursery rhymes turned grotesque by the shuddering wreckage of his lungs. Those who stood watch claimed he was calling birds to him, for a few circled overhead as if summoned by carrion scent. One landed on a blood-slicked beam and did not move. Another pecked at his ankle. He did not flinch. He may have smiled. By the time his tongue was removed, the final offering, he had gone somewhere else. His body remained on the platform, twitching occasionally, but his mind had retreated beyond reach. No priest was summoned, no rites read. The crowd had thinned, but some remained, as if unable to leave until the curtain fell. When at last Etienne stopped moving, stopped breathing, stopped bleeding, there was no announcement. A boy was sent to inform the palace. A woman wept, not for him, but for the smell. They left his body suspended until dusk. By then the flies had claimed dominion, and the ropes dripped a slow, black ichor that collected in buckets laid beneath his feet. The flesh no longer held together. He was sagging, disassembling, no longer a warning, only a grotesque sculpture of once being. It was not the king's voice he had mocked. It was the illusion of invulnerability, and for that he had been turned inside out before a kingdom. But even in death, he was not allowed disappearance. He was taken down with gloves and hooks, wrapped in canvas soaked in brine, and escorted to a vault beneath the royal chapel. Not buried, not cremated, but preserved. A silent relic of royal fury. His body, it is said, was sealed in a lead sarcophagus, the inscription reading only imitatio mortis. This was not mercy. This was precision. The chamber was narrow and silent, carved beneath the chapel with such precision that sound did not echo. It was swallowed. There, in a coffin of hammered lead, Etienne's body began the slow theatre of preservation. The outer flesh, what remained of it, congealed into something waxen and grey. The blood dried into threads along the canvas, hardened, like the veins of a leaf left in sun. The vault was guarded by no soldier, only a series of locks, as if to keep the dead from whispering upward. It was not grief that consigned him there. It was containment. To bury Etienne was to risk forgetting him, and the king, in his unspoken cruelty, did not want the people to forget. Above, the world tried to resume. The square was washed with vinegar and rainwater. The platform dismantled, burned piece by piece. The pikes, stripped of their trophies, were returned to the armory. It was as though the execution had never happened, except it had, in every corridor and parlor, in every hush that fell when the king entered a room. What had once been laughter now died in throats. Satire became heresy. Jesting, once a currency, became a liability. The royal court spoke in cautious tones, and even the rustling of silk seemed guilty. In the weeks following the flaying, 2 more men were arrested. One for quoting a line Etienne had once said about the Queen's wig, another for owning a crude etching of the execution platform. Neither were tortured. They were disappeared, wordlessly. This, too, was theatre. Where Etienne had been punished in blood and spectacle, these others were punished by erasure. The kingdom had learned. It was not the mockery alone that was punished. It was the memory of mockery. And yet memory is a cunning beast. It survives where history fails. A song began to appear in the countryside, sung by children in fields, hummed by women washing linens by rivers. A song with no beginning and no end, whose verses mimicked the cadence of the king's proclamations, twisting them into nonsense. The melody rose and fell with a peculiar stammer, a lilt of laughter just beneath the breath. It was called the Flayer's Waltz. No one admitted to writing it. No one dared to claim its origin. And still, it spread, a shadow cast by an absent flame. At court, a strange thing began to happen. The king, once quick to rage, grew silent when confronted with mimicry, even innocent imitations. A child once parroted his greeting during a garden walk and was swiftly sent away. Musicians who played anything resembling folk rhythm were banned. Laughter, once controlled, now frightened him. He began to speak less in public. His voice, once loud with performative regality, became strained. Some said it was illness. Others whispered of a curse. In his private chamber, it was said, the king began to speak to a figure that was not there, a shape he claimed stood in corners or beneath the canopy of his bed. The man with no skin, he reportedly called it. A servant once found him speaking to the fireplace as if to a reflection. The hearth was cold. The king's hands were trembling. The scent of brine clung to the room. No courtiers addressed this. They bowed more deeply, praised more loudly, hoping to appease the growing void. But the fear was no longer of punishment. It was of collapse. For when a king begins to fear his own voice, the kingdom begins to rot from the throat down. The decay did not begin with famine or rebellion. It began with whispers, soft as moth wings, weaving through the corridors of court and echoing in the cloisters where no prayers could silence them. The king no longer gave proclamations in public. His words, once broadcast from balconies and carved into marble, were now issued only through intermediaries, wax-faced scribes whose hands trembled as they read. When a decree was mocked in a rural province, the punishment was swift, not flaying, but a quiet house burned at dusk, its occupants never seen again. Still, the echoes of Etienne's torment clung like mildew to the velvet curtains and the carved wood of the throne. The city changed shape around its fear. Jesters disappeared or rebranded themselves as silent fools, adorned in bells that never rang. The theaters performed only foreign tragedies. Puppeteers lost their licenses. One puppet show that included a coughing king, entirely unspoken, only gestured, was halted mid-performance. The puppets were burned. The puppeteer vanished. The audience was interrogated, one by one, but no fire, no silence, no vanishing act could extract the roots of what had been sown. The public, though cowed, had seen too much. Even those who had not witnessed the execution felt it in their bones. The memory passed from mother to child, from drinker to drunkard in taverns far from the city walls. The tale changed in its retellings. In one version, Etienne had laughed even as the flesh was peeled from his face. In another, He had cursed the king by name, his voice rising with each slice of the blade. Some claimed the executioner himself had wept and retired, his knives shattered and buried at the roots of a tree no longer standing. The truth was more fragile, more human. Etienne had died not as a hero, but as an example, twisted into myth by the very system that had sought to destroy his memory. And now that myth poisoned the well of sovereignty. The king, once considered divine by right, had become a figure of uneasy reverence, worshipped in duty but feared in private. Even those closest to him no longer laughed when he entered a room. They looked away. They bowed too deeply. His voice, that once commanding voice, had grown thin, brittle, like parchment too often handled. He took to writing in journals no one was allowed to read. He spoke to portraits. One page boy reported seeing him place a bloodied scrap of silk beside the throne each morning. A ritual, perhaps, or a plea. The boy was dismissed the next day, found drowned in the palace fountain with roses stuffed in his mouth. No investigation followed. The silence returned, and then came the tremor, a riot outside the city gates. Not vast, not political, but personal. A group of laborers chanting a twisted lullaby, lifting an effigy of the king with its face carved into mimicry. Their mouths moved as one, repeating a single line: "Strip the voice, save the soul." They were cut down by archers before reaching the gate, but the message had landed. The king did not appear for days, and when he did, he wore gloves and spoke through an interpreter. Fear had reversed its current. Where once it had flowed from the throne down, now it trickled upward, and it brought with it decay. Time did not heal the wound Etienne had become. It ossified around it. The kingdom, once embroidered with ceremonies and echoes of divine authority, sank into a ritual of silence. Statues of the king were erected, not to celebrate, but to reinforce. They bore no inscriptions, just smooth, imperious faces, mouths always closed, and always beneath the marble, beneath the carved brows and stiff robes, the ghost of a man without skin lingered. Historians of the following century wrote of this reign with sterile detachment. They called it the era of the quiet court. They praised the absence of civil war, the control of taxes, the architectural advancements, but they wrote around Etienne, never naming him, never acknowledging the execution that had split the realm's spirit like bone cracked for marrow. It was as if, by omission, they could cauterize the infection, but memory does not abide erasure. In taverns built from the splinters of that old gallows platform, songs still drifted from lips too young to remember why they sang them. School children etched crude drawings on stones and whispered tales of a man who laughed too well and was punished too deeply. The melody of the flare's waltz survived long after the throne had changed hands. No law could silence it. No archive could contain it. One particular winter, years after the king's death, the chapel above Etienne's vault burned in a lightning strike that seared through bell tower and crypt. Monks found the stone around the lead coffin cracked, steam rising from the marble as though some long-smothered soul had exhaled at last. The sarcophagus was not opened. It was sealed again, this time with chains. No inscription remained, but in the weeks that followed, strange things were seen. A priest found blood seeping from the wall behind the altar. A wax statue of a new monarch began to melt in the absence of heat. In the city square, a street performer was arrested for mimicking the local magistrate, and the crowd, for the first time in a generation, defended him. The guards withdrew. The performer lived. The silence cracked. In time, Etienne became less a man, more a myth, a symbol of how power fears laughter more than rebellion. In art, he was painted without skin, but with a halo. In literature, he was called the unvoiced prophet. In the people's memory, he was no longer just the man who mocked. He was the one who revealed. Because in the end, it was not the execution that haunted the kingdom. It was what it proved, that a king's voice could tremble, That laughter, once loosed, could not be lashed back into silence. The flesh was taken, the voice was not.